Now I'm gonna tell you something. Want you to listen tight. Why, old General Sam was right. He warned his fellow Texans not to get involved in that fracas they call the war between the states. Sometimes those Texicans can be kind of hard-headed. Well, they fought in that war, and like General Sam predicted, they lost. Texas was kind of fortunate. Most of the fighting was off east of the Mississippi. None of our cities were burned down. But like every other southern state, our economy was destroyed. Hardly anybody at all had any money after the war. If they did, it was worthless Confederate currency. One fella found out, made pretty good wallpaper. But the folks in Texas were kind of broken up after that war. There was just no money to be had. Texas had one other advantage. Millions of longhorn cattle roamed across our prairies. Here in Texas, after the war, they might be worth $1 or $2 a head. But now that the country was rejoined, up north, most of their cattle had been used up during the war effort. They needed beef, and they were willing to pay good prices for our longhorns. Texas longhorn worth $2 here could command a price of $40 up north. The problem was how to get them there. No one had put the railroad tracks into Texas to join us to the rest of the country. We had to get on horseback and drive the cattle north to the nearest railhead, ship them off from there. Now the early cattle drives went up to Missouri, but there was civilization moving eastward. As it did, the farmers became concerned about something called Texas fever. Seemed every time a herd went up north, the local cattle would get sick and die. So they closed off the trails to Missouri and opened up a new one up into Abilene, Kansas. Called that the Chisolm Trail. What they did here, you're gonna start a cattle drive. Well, you had to get your herd together. They would always have the spring roundup right after the spring rain, so the grass was big and tall and rich, made good food for the cattle going up the trail. Usually several ranches would get together to put one herd in. A typical herd might measure between, well, 2,000 and 3,000 head of cattle. You had to hire the drovers to take the cattle north. The problem there was no money to pay the drovers. They worked on a promise of getting paid when the herd was sold up north. Usually they'd be paid $1 a day. Get your herd together. Well, you had to brand every one of them. Other herds would be going up the trail. If they got intertwined, you had to be able to tell your cattle from the others. You'd head up the trail. You're a drover on the Chisolm Trail. They called you a drover because you drove cattle. On a typical cattle drive, you'd wake up in the morning. You're lying in the grass, your saddle's your pillow, looking up at the stars. You're always awake before daybreak. First one awake was the cook. Drove the chuck wagon with all the food supplies. They didn't have refrigeration back then, so food supplies were pretty simple. Always some dried bacon, a lot of beans, and flour to make the biscuits. Well, you'd get up and have yourself a delicious breakfast, beans and biscuits and coffee. Get your horse mounted and head up the trail. You rode all day. You never pushed the cattle hard. 10 miles a day was a good cattle drive. Let them mosey, let them graze all the way up. If you did it right, when the cattle arrived at the market in Abilene, well, they'd be bigger than they were when you started out of South Texas. Things were kind of tedious, just moving the cattle along. Probably didn't stop for lunch. Might have a spare biscuit or two from breakfast down in your saddlebags. Kept going until the trail boss said it was time to circle them up, and well, then you got the cattle all together, got off your horse, stripped him down, gave him a good rub down, and sat down for a delicious supper. Usually biscuits and beans. Well, your day wasn't over yet. Somebody had to ride night herd, so you'd usually take turns on that little chore. Life on the trail. Long, tedious hours. Sometimes exciting and dangerous. Well, like when you came to a river. You always had to know where the best river crossings were. After the spring rains, those rivers could be up high, running fast. Kind of a precarious crossing. The cattle knew how to swim. Your horses knew how to swim. A lot of the drovers didn't know how to swim. Held on tight and hoped for the best. At almost every river crossing, you'd see a lonely wooden cross where somebody didn't make it. The other thing was the stampede. It could be at night. It might be a flash of lightning. It might be the howl of a lonely coyote. Cattle get scared. They're up and running, running blind. No way to stop them. All you can do is get on your horse and you try to herd them into a big circle. Try to keep them away from cliffs or rivers or anything dangerous. Try to mill them into a big circle until they get tired of running. You'd probably lose some head of cattle, trampled by the other cattle on a stampede. You might lose a horse and rider. But that was the danger on a trail. Finally, after 2, maybe 3 months, you'd get to the railhead at Abilene. Then the trail boss could sell his herd and pay off his drovers. And then, well, heck, they'd have a good bath, buy some new clothes, and maybe celebrate a bit before heading back down the trail. Life on the trail. Well, the era of the great cattle drives only lasted about 20 years. After that, they brought the railroad into Texas. Brought it into Dallas, over to Fort Worth, down through Waco, Austin, to San Antonio. No longer did you have to drive cattle all the way to Kansas, up to Abilene or Dodge City. No, now you could put them on a train and ship them off. Some folks preferred to go ahead and continue the drive. Thought it was cheaper than trains. Even that came to an end, though. And significantly, in a sense, the end of the cattle drives happened right here, in the plaza right outside the Alamo. A fella brought in a brand new invention. He called it barbed wire. Said it was lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, and cheaper than dirt. A lot of the cowboys were kind of skeptical, but they set up a barbed wire fence, ran some longhorns into it, fired off some shots. The cattle pushed hard, but they couldn't break that wire. That led to the closing of the open range. So the cattle drives came to an end. But the 20 years that those cattle went up the trail, went up the Sedalia Trail into Missouri, the Chisolm Trail to Abilene, the Great Western Trail into Dodge City, or the Good Light Loving Trail up through New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming. Historians estimate that more than 12 million longhorns went up the trail during those 20 years. The greatest migration of livestock in the entire history of the world. More important to us, every one of those longhorns that went up a trail sold for around $40 a head. Most of that money came right back down the trail to Texas, made the Lone Star State strong and great again. So we owe those Longhorns and those drovers pretty strong debt of gratitude.